Fuck, I just touched. Okay, there we go. Alright, so last night we watched I think like Vsauce's version of this. But I guess today we're gonna be watching the Lore Lodge's version, and I kind of like his work because he has like more details, and I like details. You know, on some Jack Reacher shit. Details matter, especially in a criminal investigation. So let's get into this shit. I'm gonna be
Don't you just
playing
love it when
some
murder
Modern
happens in your
Warfare in the
backyard and
background.
nobody knows who
So
did
I'll
it?
make this shit
I'm
a
Aiden
little bit
Madison.
smaller, I
Welcome back
guess.
to the now heavily armed Lore Lodge. Fox Chase is a neighborhood in northeastern Philadelphia, which I was led to believe as a college student was a very dangerous place to be. Who led me to believe this? My college ex-girlfriend, who wanted to seem more thug than she really was. When I actually went down to Fox Chase, it's a pretty nice
More
area.
thug.
I mean, it's middle class, but it's not like, the hood. Now, the neighborhood
Not
does
like
in
the
fact
hood.
border on two counties, Montgomery and Bucks, while remaining within Philadelphia County. And in recent years, it's become a lot more bustling than it was back in 1957. In 1957, it was still a rather rural area, very, very suburban, more like you would see, out in Chester County, Pennsylvania now. Now, of course, this might mean nothing to people not from Philadelphia, but to people from Philadelphia, the case of the boy in the box actually means quite a bit. And that's because in February of 1957, something very strange was discovered. Across the street from a home for wayward girls known as the Good Shepherd, run by the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, the body of a young boy between 4 and 6 years old was found in a box, wrapped in a blanket, just sitting there on the side of the road. Now, there were a couple of people who discovered it. On February 24th, 1957, an 18-year-old named John, who was a Polish immigrant, came across the body and didn't really know what to make of it. He convinced himself it was just a doll, and John, coming from, well, his parents particularly, coming from communist Poland, were very distrustful of authorities, so
Communist
worried
Poland.
that he might not be able to talk his way out of the suspicion that it was his doing, he decided not to go to the police. But the next day, a man named Frederick, a 26-year-old
Honestly, already off rip,
at LaSalle University,
he's
which is
fucking
also
smart for that.
in Philadelphia.
Yeah, he's definitely smart for that, because look at how they treated Oppenheimer. Man literally helped the United States, and he still got shat on for being fucking, just for not even being a communist, for having affiliations.
Came across that body. He claimed that the reason he pulled off the road was because he saw a rabbit run off into the woods and wanted to look for it. And of course, John, the kid who found the body the day before, had been checking his illegal rabbit traps. There might be other reasons that Frederick stopped, but we won't really get into that. There were some accusations that he used to spend a little bit too much time looking over at the girls' school, and he was, for that reason, a little bit, unwilling to go talk to the police. So what he did first was he went down to LaSalle, and he spoke to several of the priests, including his brother, and asked them what he should do. And of course, the priests told him you really should go to the police. He said he was spurred to consider it more when he heard about the case of a missing girl from Belmar, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River. So, the next morning, a cold, rainy Tuesday, Officer Elmer Palmer pulled up to the location where the body was said to be. He pulled his patrol car up along the side of Susquehanna Road, stepped out, and walked into this little thicket of trees that used to be there. And upon gazing at the body in the box, it did not take Elmer long to determine that this was not a doll. And somewhat ironically, the box was labeled "Fragile, Handle with Care." Now, Elmer had not been there long studying the scene when a nun from Good Shepherd, seeing the police car outside, decided to go take a look at what was going on, and before Elmer could stop her, she got a look at the body of the young boy in that box and immediately turned away and began praying. Before long, a police captain, 2 detectives, and an ambulance were on the way to take a look at the body. When the ambulance actually arrived to take the body to the medical examiner, it became very clear the extent of the injuries to the body they just found in the box. He had bruises all over, a few lacerations, and just was generally in pretty bad shape, though he was intact. This was not a gory situation, it was just a very sad one. His hair had been cut seemingly post-mortem, and he had 7 noticeable scars, and 3 of those scars appeared surgical. The locations, of course, were 2 of them on the chest and groin, and 1 on his ankle. So why were there surgical scars on his groin and ankle? We don't know. Chest, you can make some more assumptions, but point of the matter is, there were
Why didn't they
scars
just go to
that were
all the
cared for,
doctors and
but
look for this
the
shit?
state of his body did not
That's what I
seem
want to
to
know.
suggest the same thing. He also had irregular scars on his chest, elbow, and chin. Now, aside from the clearly visible injuries just looking at the boy, the medical examiner on autopsy was able to determine a few more things. First of all, most immediately obvious was that the boy had been circumcised. He had 3 small
Damn.
holes on his face, 1 below his right ear, and 1 on his chest. There was also a single mole on his right arm. He had a full set of baby teeth, and his tonsils were intact. Strangely, his right palm and both his feet felt wrinkled, as if they had been sitting in water for a period of time. In his left eye, under the lights, you could see that there seemed to be fluorescent blue dye in his iris. Now, this would suggest a diagnostic test, possibly for a chronic eye illness. Based on the state of the digestion of the baked beans that were in his stomach, it appeared that he had not eaten for 2 to 3 hours before his death. He also had a brown sludge coating his esophagus. Surprisingly, given the
Ew.
state of the body, he had never had any broken bones. Not at the time of death, nor at any point before that. And though the body was discovered first on the 24th of February, because it was so cold, mostly the 30s to 40s, it was a little difficult to determine when exactly he had died, because his body was being preserved more than it would in more temperate conditions. Nonetheless, detectives, the medical examiner, everybody got to work trying to identify whose body this was, and they thought that it would be a pretty easy task. The boy's face was completely intact. He was found in a large city where you could easily disperse photographs, so there was no reason to think that this was going to be a difficult case to solve. The crime appeared to be homicide, and in homicide cases, usually the perpetrator is known to the victim, and though they weren't positive, it was possible that there were other sorts of crimes committed, if you catch my drift. So the responding officers, Elmer Palmer and Sam Weinstein, were confident that they would pretty quickly have the identity of this boy, and once they had the identity of the boy, they would have their immediate list of suspects. Now, the first clue was the box itself. It was from J.C. Penney, and it had contained a bassinet. In fact, they were even able to find the exact J.C. Penney at which the bassinet had been purchased. It was at 100 South 69th Street.
Well, what the?
Furthermore, they knew when the box had arrived at J.C. Penney and when it had been purchased. It had been delivered to the store around 11/27, 1956, and then it was sold sometime between the 3rd of December and the 16th of February, 1957. Now, today this case would be open and shut. You'd know whose credit card was used to purchase the bassinet, and you would be able to quickly track that and find out who it was. But in 1957, credit cards were really in their infancy. The Diners Club cards had just started coming around.
The Diners
Worse,
Club
because
cards.
checks were unreliable, J.C. Penney had a cash-only policy. So there was really no way to track down who bought this.
Oh, I accidentally just killed a
Despite being
fucking
able to
civilian.
locate all of the
Shit.
bassinets, the FBI was unable to get any fingerprints from the box itself. So they couldn't tell if whoever had put the boy into the box had actually been one who actually purchased the bassinet, or if they just found the box later.
Found the box,
Fingerprints
yeah, that
were
is true.
taken from the boy himself, but because databases didn't exactly, exist online, you had to manually go through and check this set of fingerprints against all the other sets of fingerprints on file, and even doing that, they didn't match anybody in the system. They also found
Damn.
a hat.
I mean, he is 4 years old, right?
1/8 corduroy blue hat with a leather strap on the back. It was found just 17 feet away from the body, and it still contained the paper shape wrapping that usually goes inside of hats. It had been purchased and manufactured at Robbins Bald Eagle Hat and Cap Company at 2603 South 7th Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So they went to check. They spoke to a Hannah Robbins, who told police that the man who had come in to purchase the hat seemed to be somewhere in his late 20s, that he was blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and that he was wearing workers' clothes. Oddly enough, the hat was also one of 12 that were made, but the person who
One of
purchased it
12?
requested that the strap and buckle on the back of it be added when he purchased it. Hannah also said that the man seemed to resemble the boy in the box's photograph, but it's hard to really say. As we know, the power of suggestion is a very real thing, and if somebody hands you a photograph and says, well, did the guy look like this, you're a little bit more inclined to remember that, yeah, the guy did look like that, unless he definitely didn't. Now, one problem here is that DNA analysis was a long way off. In fact, DNA itself had only been discovered a few years prior, the Watson and Crick experiments, of course, and they did not have a system for analyzing it yet. So, you couldn't just take saliva, hair, anything that they found on the body and compare it. They could do chemical testing to see if chemicals matched between people, but that was about it. They also found a cheap cotton flannel blanket, which had been cut into 2 uneven pieces. This blanket was wrapped around the boy when he was found. But again, they couldn't really figure anything out from this. It appeared to have been washed recently, and it was mass-produced either by Beacon
Dumb
Mills
dog.
in North Carolina or Esmond Mills in Quebec. So this could have been a blanket purchased anywhere, any convenience store in the country, any general store. You could have bought this blanket, basically. You know, there was no lead from that. There were some other clues found in the General Fox Chase vicinity that police considered, such as an adult handkerchief with the initial G on it, but chemical testing that handkerchief against
G,
chemicals
Mr.
found
G,
on the boy's body did
G-Man.
not reveal any connection. They did also find a tan scarf and a size 4 flannel shirt, yellow, which was the correct size for the boy in the box, but they couldn't establish any link between those items and the body either. They were also able to find a set of clean black children's shoes, which were too large to be the boy's, but those were also found on the other side of the road. Furthermore, there was a dead cat wrapped in a blanket that was
What
found
the
nearby.
fuck?
Chemical testing also revealed no link there. Now, what about the more in-depth tests of the boy's
Yeah,
body?
but there's usually never
Who did
coincidences,
those
bro.
Well, in 1957, some
A
interesting
dead
stuff.
cat
A medical
also in a
examiner
blanket.
took tissue samples from all major organs and ran toxicology tests and found absolutely nothing. As I previously mentioned, there was a brown substance coating the esophagus, which indicates that the victim had thrown up shortly before dying. As I said before, they took fingerprints, but they didn't match anything at surrounding hospitals. They did find plenty of hair strands that seemed to just be clinging to the boy's body, and all of them, upon testing, were revealed to be the boy's own hair. Now, that did imply that he had much longer hair before he was put in the box, and they believed that the haircut was after he died. The presence of a complete set of baby teeth led Dr. Joseph Spellman, the medical examiner, to believe that the boy was under the age of 6 years old. He also noted the lack of dental work or vaccination scars. I'm not sure necessarily what a vaccination scar is, but vaccines were a new thing in the 1950s, so maybe they did them differently, and I just was not aware of that. But he had to ask himself the question, who cares enough for surgery, but not to get a polio vaccine? Hoping to bring in a fresh set of eyes, Spellman's office contacted Dr. Wilton Krugman, a professor of anthropology at nearby Penn. For those of you who might not know, the University of Pennsylvania is one of the Ivy League schools. Now, why call in a professor of physical anthropology? Well, they tend to be very accustomed to human bones. Krugman determined that the boy's height, 3 feet and 4 to 6 inches, suggested that he was about 3 years and 8 months old, but body weight, which was 30 pounds, suggested an age of only 2 years, 2 months. This was determined by the two doctors to be the result of malnutrition. And then, upon looking at his physical characteristics, they suggested Nordic, German, English, or Scottish ancestry. For those of you who know the identity of the boy before watching this video, yeah, we have the same questions. Authorities hoped that their initial investigation, looking into the wounds, the location, everything, that they would be able to determine the boy's identity and get this case over with nice and quick, and that was quickly proving to not be the case. So they went the extra mile. They took pictures of the boy's face, set him upright as he might have looked in life, and had the Philadelphia Inquirer print 400,000 copies of a flyer with information about the boy to send out with every gas bill in the city of Philadelphia. So to put that into perspective, basically every single person in the city of Philadelphia, except for those who were maybe still using coal to heat their homes, got a picture of this boy. It turned up a lot of leads. Fred Bononis, the guy who initially reported the body's location, was brought in for questioning and passed 2 lie detector tests. So they basically were like, all right, you're good. A Marine private first class named George Broomall saw the flyer upon returning home from deployment and felt it kind of resembled somebody. So he went to the morgue and said, yep, that looks like my 8-year-old brother. But while George had been away, his family had moved to the West Coast and brought that particular brother with them, and they were able to confirm that, yes, that boy was alive and well in California. Another possibility that cropped up was a kid named Stephen Damon, who had gone missing on Long Island in 1955. He was blonde, 38 inches tall, and 32 pounds when he disappeared, so there were enough similarities to consider it. So Philadelphia County and Nassau County exchanged footprints and things like that, and determined that it was very unlikely that these were the same children. Despite a Herculean effort, the Philadelphia Police Department was unable to get any closer to identifying the body, let alone making an arrest. So with no concrete leads, both the police and the public started to piece together the clues and see what they could come up with. One of these tips led to a raid perpetrated by Montgomery County Police as well as Philadelphia Police in Horsham, Pennsylvania, which is about 7.6 miles northwest of Philadelphia. They went to a farm, rounded up 4 people, questioned all of them based on an anonymous tip, and all 4 were, of course, cleared because they probably had nothing to do with it. Another case of a missing child from Rhode Island was brought in, and in this case, it was a 6-year-old and his mother who had left for Florida on February 19th, 1957, so about a week before the body was discovered, and had not turned up since. That child would have been 6 years old, blonde hair, about the same height, but about 10 pounds heavier. No connection could be established between the 2 children. Meanwhile, up in Manhattan, the body of a 5-year-old girl turned up. Initially, police thought maybe these 2 could be connected, possibly even a serial killer, but upon further investigation, they couldn't establish a connection between this girl and the boy in the box either. At this point, a number of rather absurd leads were actually investigated, but it was becoming clear that the Philadelphia Police Department really was grasping at straws. But in the ensuing years, a much stronger theory was developed by a guy named Remington Bristow. Remington was obsessed with this case, and in a good way. He was actually genuinely trying to figure out what had happened, as the police department had kind of backed off and said, we don't really know what happened here. Remington worked in the medical examiner's office, and so had access to a bunch of records, and he had a theory. About 1.5 miles away from the body's location on Susquehanna Road, over on Morden Road, there was a foster home operated by Arthur and Catherine Nicoletti, and there lived an assortment of children, sometimes as low as 5, sometimes as many as 25, as well as their 20-year-old, somewhat disabled daughter, Anna Marie Nagel, who was actually Catherine's daughter from a previous marriage and had no relation to Arthur. Now, that daughter,
No
Anna Marie
relation.
Nagel, had actually given birth to 4 children. 3 of them were stillborn, and 1 tragically died in a electric train accident at Macy's. I mean, I'm assuming it was Macy's. It just said department store, but I don't know. I thought Macy's, knowing Philadelphia. But at the time of the discovery of the boy in the box, there were only 8 kids at the foster home. 5 girls and 3 boys. All of them were accounted for. Now, is it possible that there was a child there that wasn't on the books? Sure, but there was no evidence of it. So, after kind of just checking that out and looking at the circumstantial evidence, the police determined the Nicolettis probably weren't responsible. But then in 1961, Remington Bristow decided he was going to look outside the bounds of normal police work. So, he reached out to a psychic who lived up in northern New Jersey by the name of Florence. Florence
Psychic.
Stonefield requested a piece of metal related to the boy, so Bristow presented 2 staples from the box. Now, Florence, who had never been to Philadelphia, according to her, told Remington that he should look for a large house with a wooden railing and a log cabin on the property. Now, it didn't take Bristow long, upon looking through the neighborhood, to realize that that matched the Nicoletti house perfectly. How could Florence possibly know that that house existed? That is anyone's guess. Maybe she actually had.
It's because
Philadelphia.
there's
Maybe
been a
she actually was
moida.
psychic. But considering she was an older woman and she lived
She was
in
using the
Palisades
Force.
Park, New Jersey, which
She's
is
the one with the
from
Force. The
Manhattan,
Force
it's
is with
believable
her.
that she had never been to Philadelphia. So when Bristow searched all over Fox Chase and found a large stone house with a wooden railing and a log cabin in the back, he was pretty confident that this is what Florence was telling him to look for. And he ascertained that the children were allowed to stay in the log cabin in the summer where it was a little bit cooler and they sleep on cots, had little slumber parties. So Bristow managed to arrange travel for Florence down to Philadelphia, brought her to Fox Chase to the site of the body, and then just kind of let her go, and she walked straight to the foster home. Again, it's okay to be skeptical about this. Maybe Bristow told her where it was, or, again, maybe she actually was psychic. Of course, by this point, it was 1961, and the Nicoletti family had moved away and gotten out of the foster business entirely, which probably made Remington Bristow even more sure that they were connected to it, because, you know, they did that right after the boy in the box was found. So what did he do? He went to a preview of the estate auction, and what he found in the basement was a bassinet that looked pretty similar to the one that would have been purchased at JCPenney. And then, outside on a clothesline, what did he find? Well, he found blankets that also matched the blanket wrapped around the boy in the box. So that's a box for what appeared to be the bassinet that was in the basement, and a blanket that was hanging on the clothesline, which definitely seems connected to the Nicolettis and the boy in the box.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of blankets here, man.
Drawing these conclusions. There was also a duck pond on the property, and you may recall that I mentioned that one of the boy's hands and both of his feet were pretty pruny, and Bristow thought, maybe when the boy died, he was somehow sitting in the water in such a way that his feet and this one hand would prune. For years, Bristow tried to get the police to follow up on his hypothesis, but they refused to do so. It was simply too much circumstantial evidence and no hard evidence.
Oh,
so
yeah?
at this point, the trail basically ran entirely cold. Despite all of their efforts, and for, their flaws of not looking into the Nicoletti case, the police did really try. Their decision not to investigate the Nicolettis does stand out as odd to me. Maybe somebody was paid off, or maybe they really just thought it wasn't worth their time. I think they probably should have looked into it. But that didn't stop theories from rolling in, tips and clues and hints. Throughout the 1960s, they did receive minor clues, but one of them implicated a woman named Mrs. Martinez, who was out in Colorado, and only because her case had slight similarities to what happened to the boy in the box. She had thrown a dead child into a dumpster. Not great, but not quite the same thing, and really far away to be connected. So, for 2 decades, there was really no movement until in 1984, Bristow was able to convince the Philadelphia Police Department to go and speak to the Nicolettis. 2 homicide detectives ended up interviewing Arthur Nicoletti at his home.
Man, I would hate to live around this time. Like, the chances of somebody getting away with crime were so much higher. It was just easier to get away with crime. No cameras, barely any DNA evidence. People were like less likely to come forward, I'm pretty sure.
Home in Dublin, Bucks County.
Cops weren't exactly, morally correct.
But nothing incriminating turned up in that interview, and they just dropped it, telling Bristow, I'm sorry, but there really doesn't seem to be anything here. Bristow was not really willing to take no for an answer and called Nicoletti himself. Remington asked Arthur to take a polygraph test, and Arthur declined to do so, which to Bristow was just even more evidence that something fishy was going on here. But as most
We've gone awry.
know, polygraph tests are only about 60% accurate, and there was no positive outcome to Arthur Nicoletti taking that test. Best case scenario, he passed the polygraph test. Worst case scenario, the polygraph test was inaccurate and pegged him as lying, and then he had to talk to police even more. So you can't really blame Arthur for not wanting to take the polygraph test. That's just good sense, really, whether he did it or not. It was a sensible decision on his part. At this point, he formulated a theory that perhaps the boy in the box was an illegitimate child of either Arthur Nicoletti or Anna Marie Nagel. That suspicion grew stronger when Catherine Nicoletti died and Arthur married his own stepdaughter. Bristow did not give up the chase, and eventually in 1988, he discovered that there was somebody rather important who had never been interviewed, the Nicoletti family doctor who treated all of the foster children. So he reached out to that doctor's wife, presumably because the doctor himself was dead, and the wife said that she had destroyed all of those records about 5 years earlier. You might think that's suspicious, but at the same time, it could just be that they were cleaning house, and these were old records from kids who were well into adulthood now, and they just weren't necessary anymore. In the end, despite the bassinet, the blanket, the foster system, the house and cabin, the timing of their moves, suspicious behavior...
Yeah, I'm starting to see a common trend in this case where things are like coincidentally, non-suspiciously absent. Like, how do I put this? Like the best way I could describe this is like, like with these files, like how it's been 5 years, so it could be suspicious that she got rid of them, but at the same time, it's not because, it has been 5 years. So they're not children anymore. So why would they have them?
Psychic, Bristow was not able to come up with...
It's like something that, you want to be suspicious of them, but you can't be suspicious.
Any concrete, hard evidence. It was all circumstantial, and that was not enough to convince the police department to launch a full investigation of the Nicolettis. Still, when Bristow died in 1993, he was confident that he had pegged the right suspect. But with Bristow's death, the case kind of went cold, at least until March of 1998, when the Philadelphia Police Department, at this point the case being led by Detective Tom Augustine, who had been 11 when the Boy in the Box case actually happened and had carried a lifelong passion for it, accompanied by the Vidocq Society, which is a private investigatory society founded by several Philadelphia police officers, teamed up to try and figure out if they could reopen this case and get to the bottom of it with the new technology available. And one of the first things they did was file to exhume the body to take DNA samples. And they weren't able to get nuclear DNA, which would be the best possible outcome, but they were able to gather some mitochondrial DNA. which is a little bit more difficult to use, but it can still give you some leads. The boy's identity was not discovered at this point. However, they were able to use that DNA to rule out that it was not Stephen Damon. And with the case now receiving new attention, TV stations started to take interest, and not just local news. The television program America's Most Wanted ran a segment on it on October 3rd, 1998, and that brought in about 150 new tips. However, those tips,
that's good shit.
At least not immediately. Because a little bit
Shucks.
later, they started to receive some very interesting information. On February 25th, 2000, the Philadelphia Police Department received a call from a Cincinnati-based psychiatrist. That psychiatrist said that one of his patients had called him in a panic early in the morning, before dawn, about a burden she just had been carrying for so long, and she needed to finally tell the world. Initially, this woman was known as M, and the book I used to do most of my research for this case refers to her as Mary. And that burden that she wanted to unload, not to her psychiatrist who had heard the story before, but to the Philadelphia Police Department, was about a murder that occurred in 1957 involving a young boy. So she asked the doctor to get into contact with the Philadelphia Police Department, and for months and months, they received letters giving bits and pieces of details about her childhood in Philadelphia. Basically, her providing them with the evidence that she, in fact, did know something about the case. Detective Tom Augustine, who was the Philadelphia police detective actually assigned to the case, as well as Detective Joe McGillen and Bill Kelly, who were Vidocq Society members, basically found her letters believable, but at the same time, there was nothing in those letters that you couldn't get out of a travel magazine or watching TV programs about Philadelphia. So, in the meantime, as they had no real leads from this woman, they went and looked back at some other stuff. Augustine, thinking, maybe Bristow actually was onto something, went back to reinvestigate the Nicoletti angle. Now, by this point, in the year 2000, Arthur Nicoletti was dead, but his stepdaughter/wife, Anna Marie Nagel Nicoletti, she was not dead. So, Tom tracked her down. She was in a nursing home. He headed up to that Bucks County address, walked in, spoke to some of the patients there, kind of made himself a presence, one that you might not notice, and then walked in to speak to Anna Marie Nagel Nicoletti. And he presented himself as perhaps a long-lost relative, asking her, "Oh, do you remember me?" And what he was hoping to do was snag a drop of saliva, a fallen strand of hair, a teardrop, something that might contain her DNA. So
that is sneaky bastard.
About the boy in the box. Before he could do that, a man in a suit, who he believed was probably somebody important, walked in, asked who he was, what he was doing. He said, "I'm Detective Tom Augustine of the Philadelphia Police Department," and he was told by this man, Anna Marie Nagel Nicoletti was not to speak to anybody without family present, which is odd, because she was clearly old and probably suffering from dementia. So, of course, the question there is, who were they trying to protect? Because it couldn't possibly be her. Tom, lacking a court order, really couldn't do anything and just left the building thinking, yeah, a court order would be nice here. But around this time, they actually did get a break in the M theory. On March 23rd, 2002, they received a letter from M. The letter gave more detail than had ever been given before. It detailed the professions of her parents. Her father was a science teacher. Her mother was a librarian, and Kelly and McGillen were able to use this information to track down a neighbor who actually remembered that family right next to the house in which she claimed to have lived. She recalled that they were a pleasant couple, rather private, who lived next door for at least 40 years along with their little girl, a girl that she described as quiet but quite intelligent. So, with this escalation in the M theory, all three of those detectives headed out to Cincinnati, and they went to the psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist acted as a mediator liaison between the two to make sure that M was comfortable, and she told them a story. I would like to note that there's a little funny episode in the book where the detectives kind of find this guy to be, this psychiatrist to be pretty arrogant. They mentioned how he used the term curriculum vitae, and they were like, yeah, we all took Latin too, guy. Mary tells the detectives that she is actually a PhD chemist who works for a nearby office of a major pharmaceutical company, and they positively cannot find out about this interview. The detectives say they won't, we're keeping it anonymous, don't worry about it, your job is safe. At this point, I went and looked up, who could this be, who has offices in Cincinnati, and what I found was J&J, Teva, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, a number of other ones. I don't know when these offices opened, but this was in 2002, so it's believable that they could have been open at the time. I eventually did find out what company it was, but we'll get to that. At this point, I do need to drive home the point that in 2002, therapy was a little bit more of a taboo subject. It wasn't kind of how it is today, where pretty much everybody has some form of therapist and openly talks about mental health and all of that, and it's kind of accepted that everyone's got their own cocktail of mental health issues. In 2002, you didn't really tell people you went to therapy, and you absolutely didn't tell anybody that you were mentally ill.
Yeah, this is true, dude. When I was growing up, My sisters lived here. My dad and them had mad problems, so we used to have to go to fucking therapy. I remember the kids in the school. It would be weird towards me because of it.
Yeah. And then M told the detectives about her childhood, and it is a ghastly story.
And
She said her
teachers
parents
would
went
treat
to
me
the Lower
weird
Merion
too.
School District, and Lower Merion is actually a high school that my high school played when I was there. This was a very weird case to research. She said that her parents were very well liked, charismatic, that they probably signed 1,000 yearbooks. Behind closed doors, however, they were much different people. She claimed that her father molested her for years, and her mother both encouraged and even sometimes took part in that because her father allowed her mother to indulge in her perversions, which were basically the same, just with little boys instead of little girls. Now, this does kind of track. One of the most common professions for pedophiles is public school faculty. It's one of the few places that you can be around children all day, all the time, and nobody questions it. Now, I am about to read you some stuff about this case and everything that happened, and for specifically M and her family, I have chosen to use their real names because I've looked into it and everybody involved is dead and none of them have remaining kids. So we're safe on this one. Later in this video, I will be talking about some people and I will be changing their names. So chasing this line that we know that M, that her mother was a librarian, her dad was a science teacher, and they both worked for Lower Merion School District, I was actually able to locate, by pouring through yearbooks, the identity of the only librarian at the school at that time, in 1957. It was a woman named Marjorie F. Davis. And by looking at census records, I was able to confirm that, yes, in fact, she did have a husband who was a high school physics teacher, James B. Davis, and they did have a daughter who would have been the right age to be M. And now we're going to go into M's story, and I'll get later into how we actually confirmed who M was and all of that and made sure that she was real. But we did. So, M's story kind of goes as follows. When she was 13 years old, her mother put her in the car, drove her to another house. She wasn't paying too much attention, but she could tell that they were still in Philadelphia, though they drove for a while. And they pulled up to a house, and the house was described as, all of these being close together, very close to the street. Her mother got out of the car, walked up to the door. A woman opened the door, holding a baby. Her mother handed the woman an envelope. She heard a man inside say, "Did you get the money?" The woman handed over the baby to Marjorie. Marjorie got back in the car and handed the baby to M. M described several things about the baby, like that it felt like he had a filled diaper and that he smelled bad, but she didn't really mind because the baby was cute and all that. And that's how they came to possess this child. It's important also to note that M claims that at this point in time, she did not realize how screwed up her family situation was, that most fathers don't assault their daughters and most mothers don't encourage that, and most people also don't purchase children from random strangers. And you might be asking, how is it possible?
What the fuck is going on?
Well, it was the 1950s and people were a lot less open about their personal lives than they are today. Like, significantly less open. Talking about, that subject was completely taboo. So it's entirely possible that she really didn't know that this was wrong and that she didn't know how to handle it. When they arrived back at the house, her mother said the child could not stay upstairs.
I could believe that.
And that he would have to live in the basement. And she brought down a thick cardboard box, some blankets, and a couple of dog dishes to serve as food trays. And that's where the boy was going to sleep, in an old coal bin in the back of the basement, with a drain for a toilet. Meanwhile, M was not allowed to go down into the basement alone. She could go down when she was accompanying her mother, and she could interact with the child, but she wasn't allowed to do it alone. And she noted that when she talked to him, when she interacted with him, he didn't really interact back. He didn't speak to her, he didn't form sentences, he didn't really make sounds, he just kind of sat there unresponsive. This led M to believe that he was mentally handicapped. In fact, she says later in the interview that she doesn't remember him ever talking or even blabbering, really. M also mentions that about once a week the boy would get a bath, which was necessary because he was living in an old coal bin and was constantly covered in coal dust, that his hair never really got cut, and that sometimes when her mother went down there to interact with the child, she was to feed him or something like that, she was down there an oddly long period of time. With what Mary had said about her parents' sexual behaviors, we can only assume the worst. I know I just called her Mary. That's what the author of the book, David Stout, referred to her as. M also says that she remembers going hungry as a child, that often she would have just barely enough food, and that her parents really didn't explain why they only had a little bit of money for food, considering that while teachers and librarians typically don't make tons of money, they should have been making enough money to feed their children. And she
Yeah, what
also
the
said
fuck?
that they didn't really have normal family sit-down dinners, just somebody would make food and they'd eat when there was food. So the whole family dynamic was very strange, yet outwardly, everybody seemed to like her parents. That brings us to the night of the murder. M has referred to the child in this interview as Jonathan. She says that one night, when it was Jonathan's bath time, her mother went downstairs to get him, and based on a commotion she heard, it sounded like something had happened to upset her mother. She heard Jonathan's feet being bumped up and down the stairs on the way up, and that then she made him sit on the floor of the bathroom while she ran the bath, and M was ordered to trim his very dirty fingernails. Bath finished running, and she dunked the boy into the steaming hot water, which caused him to scream, and he was splashing around, which got her mother, Marjorie, wet, and at this point, Marjorie screamed back at him until he went quiet. Either due to nerves or simply bad food, he ended up throwing up the baked beans they had eaten that night into the bathwater, at which point Marjorie yanked him out and got very, very angry. She started slapping him over and over in the face until eventually he fell down and hit his head pretty hard. And at this point, she started just wailing on him, punching him all over the torso and face until he no longer struggled, and she screamed at M to get out of the bathroom. She says she then heard splashing as the boy was thrown back into the tub, and her mother telling the boy to wake up. Despite trying to stay awake to see what happened, she was rather traumatized and eventually just got too tired and fell asleep. The next morning, Jonathan was still in the bathtub, though the water had been drained, and his hair had been cut sometime during the night. At this point, her mother wrapped the body in a flannel blanket and took her downstairs to the basement and out a side door into the driveway. This is actually a pretty common structural element in Fox Chase. The now 15-year-old Mary sat in the car with her mother with the body in the trunk, and they drove from Lower Merion to Fox Chase to Susquehanna Road, where she describes that there was a large church across the road and a thicket of trees, where they were. Now, at this point in the story, Mary said something that was available on the internet, but did stick out. You see, Detective Kelly, who was one of the Viddoc Society members, was actually one of the original investigators of the case. And at the time, he spoke to a witness, a Good Samaritan, who, seeing a stopped car with the trunk open and a middle-aged woman and an adolescent boy standing next to it, had offered to help them, but they never turned their faces towards him, and they simply were like, no, we're fine, you can carry on. He had thought they were dumping something at first, and then he realized, maybe they need to change a tire. He ended up just taking them at their word and leaving. Now, of course, they probably were dumping something. Now, what's important about this is the physical description of M from the detectives, because it occurred to Detective Kelly that what had been described as a 12 to 15-year-old boy could have been the rather tall and unusually broad-shouldered M, who, at her now middle age, was tall and broad-shouldered and likely was the same way when she was 15. That's typically about the time that women physically mature. So it's entirely possible that 15-year-old Mary could have been mistaken for a 12 to 15-year-old boy. After the motorists had moved on, they took the body out of the trunk and
Human hubris.
discovered that there was in fact already a box there. So that explains where the box came from. Perhaps it was the same box that had carried the bassinet that was in the Nicoletti household, and the Nicolettis had just dumped the box there. At this point, Mary's story kind of ends. It's a tragic story of child abuse, molestation, and probably sociopathic parents, but it does have an end, and she goes on to say that her father eventually died, heart issues, and her mother died with dementia in an Ohio nursing home. She had moved her mother to Ohio when she got sick, and for the last several years that she knew her mother, she says her mother did not know her. At this point in my research, I also was skeptical about whether or not Mary had actually lived in the house. I decided I was going to track down her identity. So I did just that. And I was able to confirm that Marjorie F. Davis was a real person and that James B. Davis was a real person, used their census records, and conveniently, the 1950 census listed that they had a daughter named Martha E. Davis, born in 1944. Now, according to M,
Jesus
Martha,
Christ,
she
some
worked
Batman
for
shit.
a major pharmaceutical company that would have been somewhere near Cincinnati. Well, I was able to find an obituary for a Martha E. Davis, born in Philadelphia, who died in 2020 at the age of 76, meaning that she was born in 1944, who had multiple degrees, looked the way that this woman was described in the
2020.
interview, and most importantly, worked for
4
Eli
years
Lilly.
ago.
Now, there are a few contradictions here that I'll get to, but I'm confident this is the right person. And once again, all of these people are dead, and none of them left behind children. There are no people connected
Good.
to the Davis family who are implicated in any of this. So
God,
I'm
this
not
go
defaming,
extinct.
I'm not trying to slander anybody. I'm just trying to show you that these are factual details of the case that simply have not been revealed by the police yet. And I'm not the only person to come to this conclusion. I did find it in a few different message boards.
Dude, we're talking
nothing
about
with a ton of traction, so I'm
child
pretty
beaters
confident
and
that
predators.
this is the first time a rather large
I don't give a
audience
fuck
will
about
be
slander.
so, the dates line up, the profession lines up, the places line up, and her psychiatrist confirmed that the story she told to the detectives is the same one he heard when she first opened up about it to him in 1989. Prior to that, it seems that he was one of the only people she had ever told about this, and probably the only person she had ever told in that degree of detail. Most importantly, she told that story in 1989, and the website, americasunnknownchild.net, which actually compiled all of the information about the case, did not go online until 1998. So it's impossible, if her psychiatrist is telling the truth, that she got this information from the website. But of course, like I said, there are a few contradictions, a few mismatches. Those mismatches could be due to power of suggestion, it could be due to the amount of time that had elapsed, or even just to the officers not correctly remembering what was said. Although it does appear that they recorded the interview portion, the actual story being told, though from the book it seems like maybe they didn't record the part where she gave them the little bio of herself, that she was a chemist for Eli Lilly and all of that stuff. For example, David Stout's book claims that she had a PhD in chemistry. From what I can tell from her obituary, her PhD was in acoustics, and she had a Bachelor of Science in computer science as well as Bachelor of Science in speech pathology. It's possible the obituary left out a doctorate in chemistry. It's possible that the detectives misremembered. What we know is that she did work for Eli Lilly, pharmaceutical company. That lines up. Her obituary does list James B. Davis, 1899 to 1967, as her father, which lines up with the census records. She says that the boy's name was Jonathan, but as we know today, his name was actually Joseph. That could just be her, not having a perfect recollection. Jonathan and Joseph are close enough. They both have J-O. I would be inclined to say that either this was the author of the book changing the names for security purposes, maybe he had stipulations that he had to change certain details in order to be granted the interviews. I don't know. But what I do know is Jonathan and Joseph, 50 almost years apart, close enough to say she's probably not lying. And this also seems to be a point where the police may have reached their own dead end. Who did they buy the boy from? Or was it a purchase, or was it a reimbursement? How'd they get their hands on Joseph? Well, at the time, the police didn't know the identity of the boy in the box. It was 2002. Today, we know that it's Joseph.
2002 now.
And that allowed me to figure some things out, which I'll talk about later in the video. Now, Martha's account, and I highly encourage you to read it in the book, The Boy in the Box, which, again, by David Stout. I'll probably link it on Amazon in the description here. The police were not convinced, or at least the active police. The Vidocq Society guys, they were willing to believe Martha, but Tom Augustine, who of course worked for the Philadelphia Police Department and was the lead detective assigned to the case, he needed more than just hearsay, more than circumstantial evidence. One spot where he was caught up was the lack of notes from the psychiatrist. Now, not all psychiatrists take notes, and even fewer probably keep them for 13 years. And he was a little confused about the situation with the acquisition of the child. Was this a payment or was it a reimbursement? And he's of course quoted as saying, if we could prove just one thing about it, we'd have it solved. And if we could disprove just one thing, we'd throw our tip in the garbage. So it's very clear that, they were struggling with this. And that's not a quote given immediately after this interview. That's a quote given later after more extensive investigations to try and corroborate her story. Now, at this point in 2002, Lower Merion has been implicated. So, the Montgomery County District Attorney, Bruce Castor, decided to assign a few police officers, some from the county level and some from the Lower Merion Township level, to go and investigate the Lower Merion aspect of the case. For those who might not understand the term township, I know things like this vary from place to place. Pennsylvania breaks things down into counties. Counties are broken down into townships or boroughs. Those are the municipal level of government, and then after that, you've got towns and villages, which typically do not have their own governmental structure aside from like a school district, but that's usually at the township level. Now, to be very clear, D.A. Castor was definitely skeptical of the story. He fell more on the Augustine camp, but it was something they couldn't not investigate. Meanwhile, detectives Kelly and McGillen were very invested in Martha's story, and they decided to try and track down her home. They did successfully find her house in Lower Merion and find neighbors that could corroborate that, yes, in fact, that family did live there, but the neighbors also said that they had never seen a boy there. Now, of course, according to Martha, the boy had been brought to the house at nighttime as a baby, had been kept in the basement basically the entire time except for baths, and when he died, they brought him out through a side door and then drove him several miles to Philadelphia. So it really is possible that nobody would have seen the child, and it's not like they had a finished basement. It's not like it was furnished a little hangout area. There was really no reason for visitors to the house to check out the basement. Also, they were finding that the people who
Damn.
actually knew...
Can you imagine going there and
said
there's
that
somebody
they might have
secretly
been
being
the very
tortured?
Good old American as apple pie types. But, of course, as we know, sociopaths are generally pretty good at masking it, and charismatic and well-liked. It's entirely possible, it really is, that the outward reputation was very different from the reality. And throughout all of this, Augustine was asking himself, why does Martha hate her parents so much? Well, if the story Martha told was true, it makes complete sense why she would hate her parents. They were assaulting her, they were torturing her and this little boy for years. But that wasn't the only thing that Kelly and McGillen managed to track down, because they did find Martha's college roommate. And when they asked her about all of this, she confirmed that, yeah, in college, Martha had told her that her mother murdered somebody. She dismissed it as, silly, scary stories told in a college dorm room, but that was a pretty big boon to Martha's story. At the very least, the accusation that her mom killed this boy, if not the rest of the details. But what McGillen and Kelly could not do was get inside Martha's house, because the woman who lived there was very concerned that her 12-year-old daughter would be scared of the possibility that someone was murdered in their house. And this took a while. They started chasing down these leads in 2002, and it wasn't until autumn of 2003 that they finally were able to reach an agreement with the mother who owned that, or lived in that house, that they could come, but they had to be out of uniform, in unmarked cars. They couldn't tell the neighbors. It had to be discreet. They agreed. 3 detectives, again, Augustine, McGillen, and Kelly, went, as well as 2 crime scene techs, and they had a
Bro.
the bathroom had been rented.
Yo, if I was this fucking cop, dude, and this bitch is telling me all these conditions, I would have been like, yo, bro, if you don't get your fucking ass out of here, bro, with all these fucking stipulations and shit, bro. Like, what the fuck? We're trying to bring justice to this kid who was fucking, like, robbed of a life. And you're going on about, oh, my daughter might be scared, bro. I'm sorry, but fuck your daughter, dude. I don't give a fuck about your daughter. This kid is dead. Like, what? Like, at least your daughter's alive and safe, dude. This kid is dead. Like, let's find out who killed this guy. Like, fucking seriously.
The walls have been repainted, but in the basement, all 3 of them agreed, yeah, this looks like there was a coal bin down here, based on the construction of some rafters, and of course all of these men grew up in Philadelphia at around the same time that all this was going down. They would have known what all this looked like. They also noticed that there was newer concrete poured on a certain spot on the floor in a rectangular pattern, and that could possibly be covering up a drain. It would make sense. Why else would you pour concrete into a random part of the floor? In basically every possible way, that basement was exactly as Martha had described it. Augustine, despite being skeptical of the entire situation, did agree that it looked like there was probably a coal bin there, and this basement did match what Martha had described. But wouldn't it also match, like, any of the houses there? Perhaps most importantly, there was a side door exactly where she said there had been a side door leading out to the driveway. So, she must have at least had an intimate knowledge of the home, which indicates that she was telling the truth about growing up there, and possibly everything else. And this kind of leads us into most of the objections to Martha's story. There were things like, oh, well, she has a history of mental illness, but what mental illness is not specified, and it could well have just been anxiety, depression, something simple. It doesn't necessarily need to mean she was psychotic, and it seems unlikely that somebody with a serious mental disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, something like that, would be able to succeed on their own to the level that she did. Multiple degrees, a PhD, research scientist at Eli Lilly.
You'd be surprised.
It's possible that she could be both completely broken and mentally just off the wall nuts, and also successful that way. Now, if we're talking like antisocial personality disorder, sure, but that still doesn't explain why she would make up this entire story. And again, if she's telling the truth, it makes sense that she would tell this story. It would be the right thing to do. Another issue is that friends and neighbors do claim that the Davis parents were upstanding citizens, that they were good people, they were well-liked. There was no reason to suspect them of anything, but as we know, as true crime has become more and more popular, sociopaths are not always obviously sociopaths. Killers, abusers, pedophiles, they can all cover their tracks.
I was about to say, like, what?
And especially in the 1950s, where technology was
It
so
was doo-doo, yeah.
You didn't have Facebook, you didn't have Snapchat, you didn't even have a cell phone. Whatever went on inside your house, nobody was going to know about it unless you showed them or somebody spoke up. And Martha, being 15 and likely scared of retribution, didn't speak up. And yet, despite there being
yeah, they're her
evidence that
parents.
she lied, there's also only circumstantial evidence to suggest she told the truth. Because of this, the case remained open, and there was really no movement. And how could there be? Both of the Davises were dead. The only remaining person was Martha. So the police were left with an option. Either they say, we think this is what happened, case closed, and possibly let the real killer get off and condemn a perfectly normal family to eternal bad reputation. I don't know where I was going with this terminology. But my point is, they
there's some
probably
guy here.
said, we just don't have enough evidence to say that we're certain about this, and the ramifications could be too great. Meanwhile, the Nicoletti case had not been completely settled. In 2007, a warrant was issued for a DNA sample from Anna Marie Nagel Nicoletti, who at this point was barely lucid at all. 2 Philadelphia County police detectives and 1 Bucks County police detective went to fulfill this order to take her DNA sample. And that test ended up confirming what was already suspected. Anna Marie Nagel Nicoletti had no DNA connections to the boy in the box. And from 2007 to 2022, there was essentially no public movement. In 2021, they actually did uncover the boy's identity, but they didn't release that until just last month, December of 2022. What they discovered was that the boy's name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, that he'd been born in January 1953, and the way that happened is some of the most 21st century stuff you're ever going to understand, because a man named Justin Thomas bought his then-girlfriend a DNA test kit. She broke up with him, so he took it himself, and a little while later, that pinged something. This was in 2017. That pinged something in the system of Identifinder International, which is an organization that I suppose does this kind of thing. They said that his DNA was a partial match for a cold case in Philadelphia, but they would need more DNA to confirm it from his mother. So he walked his mother through the DNA test, she sent it in, and sometime later he got the text from his sister saying that the boy's name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, and that was a name he recognized because his grandmother's family were Zarellis. Not only that, the DNA test confirmed that his mother was likely a first cousin of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. So his maternal grandmother was a sibling of the parent of the boy in the box. And this is the point at which I'm going to stop using real names.
Sibling.
Why am I not using real names? Because I've given you all of the names that are publicly available, and I would prefer to not, accidentally defame anybody if I do turn out to be wrong. But as the title of this video suggests, I do think we may have solved this case. There is a Zarelli family in Philadelphia that involves 5 siblings, and all of them are within the correct generation to be Joseph Augustus's parents. One of those siblings, who we'll refer to as Meredith, she appears to be the grandmother of Justin Thomas. I know that because she has a daughter with the surname Thomas, and it just works out, okay? Just trust me on this. You can do your own research. I'm not going to say the words, because if I say the words, it opens me up to legal liability. But go ahead and do the research yourself if you want to. But I can confirm that, yes, this Zarelli sibling is definitely, almost certainly, the grandmother of Justin Thomas, who again is the only person who has been publicly named. So if Meredith Zarelli, as we're calling her, is Justin's grandmother, then Joseph's parent, whichever Zarelli it was, must be one of her 4 siblings. We'll call this one Jane. Jane Zarelli was born in 1922 and had 1 son. The next Zarelli, that we'll call Kate, was born in 1919, had 1 daughter. One of the 2 brothers of the family, we'll call him John, was born in 1926 and had 3 children, and he married in 1959. I was unable to get marriage dates for the two sisters. And the last one we'll call Dave Zarelli. He was born in 1928, and he had 4 children, and he was married in 1952. One little tidbit of information that the police did let out was that Joseph Augustus Zarelli has living half-siblings on both sides, which is precisely why I'm changing names, because I don't want to be that guy who goes and causes a ruckus. If you want to do the research we just did,
Causes a
all of
ruckus.
this information is publicly available. I just don't want to, cause trouble. But due to the fact that we know he has multiple half-siblings, that rules out the 2 sisters. And of course, Meredith, who is she's not involved. So that just leaves John, the older of the brothers, and Dave, the younger of the brothers. Both of them had multiple children, and both of them got married in the 1950s. If John is the father of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, then it's possible that Joseph was conceived out of wedlock, which explains why he only has half-siblings, and why he has half-siblings on his mother's side. That seems to probably be maybe genetic testing, or the police have his birth certificate. They know the names of these people. Like, they know who this is. It's just an active investigation, so they won't release the names yet until they actually know. They do have suspects and all that. They're just not public. Now, why would this be a likely scenario? Well, it's because John was not yet married when Joseph Augustus Zarelli was born in 1953. So it's possible that he had a girlfriend, they weren't too careful, ended up having a kid, gave the kid up for adoption, and it ended up in the hands of Marjorie Davis. Now, Dave, a little bit more murky because he was married in 1952, so an out-of-wedlock child, a little bit more of an issue. Now, obviously, out-of-wedlock child in 1950s in the first place, especially in an Italian Catholic family, not a great situation. Out of wedlock and the result of an affair, even worse situation. Or, based on he got married in 1952, Joseph was born in 1953, in January of 1953. Maybe this was their first child together, and for some reason they weren't prepared to take care of it, and rather than have an abortion, which was an incredibly dangerous and often illegal procedure at the time, they chose to give it up for adoption. But if so, why is the child not listed in any obituaries or census records? I get it.
Yeah, and what's up with that envelope?
He wasn't alive long enough to be involved in the census, and I don't know. Just the angle that it was John's kid makes a little bit more sense to me, because they would explain why there's less records. But I'm pretty confident that the parent of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is either this John Zarelli or Dave Zarelli, who, again, I will not give you their names myself, but this is all publicly available information if you catch where I'm going.
We'd initially filmed this segment when we filmed the rest of the video, and I'm sorry for the different location and the echoey audio, but we had to get this done under the wire. I wanted to clarify the theory I have here, because the one I presented was a little garbled, and this is a more streamlined version of it. The man that we're referring to in this video as John Zarelli is who I believe is Joseph Augustus Zarelli's father. I believe this because of some name similarities, some ages, and most importantly, because John was not married until 1959, and we know that Joseph Augustus Zarelli has living half-siblings on both sides, which means that his mother cannot have been the woman that John eventually married. That woman who is the mother of all of John's recorded children. So, what I believe happened is that John Zarelli had a child out of wedlock with a girlfriend, because these two people were living together when Joseph Augustus Zarelli was supposedly bought by Marjorie Davis. I believe that because it was the 1950s and abortion was not yet legal in Pennsylvania, and this was an Italian Catholic family, they decided to keep the child, have it, and that they likely stayed together for a couple of years. Because Joseph Augustus Zarelli was about 2 years old when he was picked up by the Davis family, I think what happened is that he was not developing at the rate that John Zarelli expected a child should. Autism was not well understood in the 1950s, and it's very likely that this child was somewhere on the spectrum due to the fact that we know from Martha's story that he was nonverbal. Of course, this is assuming that Martha's story is correct, but we have no other leads. Because the child was nonverbal and born out of wedlock, putting it into the foster system to be adopted would have likely been quite the process that two young people in the 1950s did not want to go through. I believe, rather charitably, that most likely they tried to give the child up to a loving home privately, that they maybe even accepted some recompense, some cash, for their efforts, for their burden, so to speak. Unfortunately, if I'm correct, that means they gave the child to Marjorie F. Davis, who went home with her husband James B. Davis and her daughter Martha E. Davis to that Lower Merion house where the story I told you that I relayed from Martha unfolded. At this point, with the child dead, I believe they dumped him on the side of Susquehanna Road, that passing motorist did in fact see Marjorie F. Davis and Martha E. Davis standing next to that car. He claims he did not see their faces, which is why it's possible that he was not, in fact, looking at a teenage boy as he thought, but a broad-shouldered, tall teenage girl. Now, of course, the only people who can confirm or deny my theory on this are the Philadelphia police. They have Joseph Augustus Sorelli's birth certificate, and they know his mother's name. I may be correct, and based on the available public evidence, again, everything in this video is publicly available information. And if you want to go and look it up yourself, you can do so, and you can probably come to the same conclusion I did, find the same people I did, and if you want to make your own theory, write your own story, make your own video, and, you know, put it out there to the world. But for the sake of ethics, we're choosing not to name these individuals.
I guess that's a smart choice.
The Philadelphia Police Department will eventually release the information.
Yeah, don't get sued, dude. Just entertain us.
And we will know whether or not we're right with this theory. But that could take a long time, because they may feel they need to wait until all of Joseph Augustus Sorelli's living siblings have passed on, so that nobody is immediately impacted or implicated by that announcement, should we be correct. Once again, I want to reiterate that it is not our intention to defame anybody or accuse people of things they did not do, but it does occur to us, not with those Sorellis necessarily, but part of the reason that we did in fact name James and Marjorie Davis is in case there was anyone else who was victimized by these people, who feels they can't come forward, who feels that they were alone. We want you to know that, as far as we can tell, you were not alone, and, you know, your pain is valid. And as we said before, Marjorie, James, and Martha Davis have all passed on, and there are no known living offspring of any of those people. We are, of course, just investigators, just YouTubers. We are not the police, and we hope that nobody takes our words as encouragement to harass anybody, cause problems, or interfere in the investigation. We just want to give you the information that we have. With all of that said, I'm going to throw it back to the original version of this recorded video so that you can get the last of it and see the outro.
And, you know, I hope that story makes sense, and I hope that eventually the police will come out with a story that matches and I will be vindicated. If not, you know, at least we tried. But at the very least, we've given you the story of The Boy in the Box from start to finish. This was a grueling project. It involved me reading so many articles, pouring through census data, through yearbooks, 30 pages of handwritten notes that I took. You know, we really hope that this was a good overview of the case. I do think it's worth noting that this video got pushed back like 3 weeks because we wanted to do this in December, but the more I dug in, the more I discovered that there were layers and layers and layers to this story, so it was a much more in-depth project. This was probably 40 to 50 hours of research, and, you know, if this is the style of content that you like, if you like this depth, then we can keep doing it, but we need to know that it's something that's worth it. So let us know in the comments if you liked how this video turned out, and if
yeah, that was a pretty good video.
Let us know in the comments. If you think that we're wrong, let us know.
Damn, yeah. If you or anybody you know, Chad, has, you know, been caught in a situation like that, speak up, dude. Because the longer you wait, you're just letting these pieces of shit get away with this longer, and potentially, you know, like, I don't want to put fucking more pressure on victims, but at the same time, you know, it's kind of like putting these motherfuckers in jail is kind of like a marathon, you know. The longer you prolong the marathon, I mean, it's like, yeah, it's like a marathon that you don't want to begin. Like, this could be a short race if you know, if you and enough people speak up and, you know, do what you're supposed to do. But if you keep hiding this shit, you're just turning what is essentially supposed to be, you know, like a 5-minute race into a marathon. Because now you're just letting these guys, you know, survive longer. And I get that you might be scared and shit, but trust me, overcoming your fears and getting these fucking pricks in jail will be much worth it in the long run. And like I said, like, and you not speaking up, you're letting these fucking pieces of shit continue on doing what they're doing to other fucking people. And I'm pretty sure you don't want that. So, but yeah, that was a pretty sick video. This video is already long enough. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace.